They told me never to look up at the old oak tree. But some warnings come too late, and some sights can never be unseen. Welcome to a place where childhood innocence meets the darkness that lurks in the spaces between life and death, where memory becomes nightmare and the past refuses to stay buried. I need to tell you about something that happened when I was 6 years old, something that changed the way I see the world, the way I understand what lingers in the spaces we think are safe. It's been over 20 years now, but I still wake up some nights with the phantom feeling of being watched from above. Still feel that cold mist rolling across my skin like fingers made of fog. My grandmother is gone now. She passed 3 years ago, and with her went the last person who truly understood what we saw that day, what we both witnessed hanging in that tree. But before she died, she made me promise something. She made me promise to tell this story, to warn others, because she believed that some places hold on to death like a scar holds on to flesh, permanent and raised and forever tender to the touch. The house was my grandmother's, a small home on the outskirts of a town so small it barely registered on most maps, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and secrets were currency, more valuable than gold. The neighborhood was old, established before the war, with houses that had seen generations come and go, their foundations settling deeper into the earth with each passing decade. Oak trees lined every street, their massive trunks thick as small cars, their branches creating canopies that turned the roads into tunnels of green shade during summer. It was beautiful, really, the way those trees stood like sentinels, like they were guarding something ancient and important. But my grandmother's tree was different. Even among those giants, it stood apart, but not in a way that inspired wonder or comfort. The tree in her backyard was enormous, easily 40 feet tall, with a trunk so wide it would have taken 3 grown men holding hands to encircle it. But unlike its brothers and sisters that dotted the neighborhood with their verdant glory, this oak was dead, or at least that's what I thought at the time. The bark had been stripped away completely, leaving the wood beneath exposed to the elements, turned a sickly grayish color that reminded me of cigarette smoke frozen in time. There were no leaves, not a single one, not in spring, when everything else burst into life, not in summer when the world was green and full. The branches stretched out like the skeletal fingers of some buried giant trying to claw its way out of the earth, twisted and gnarled in ways that seemed deliberately malicious, as if the tree itself was angry at its own existence. Even on the brightest, sunniest days, when the rest of the yard was bathed in golden light, the space beneath that tree remained dim, as if it existed in its own pocket of perpetual dusk, as if the sun itself refused to touch it too directly. I hated that tree. I hated it with the pure instinctive fear that children possess before the world teaches them to rationalize away their intuition. Whenever my grandmother sent me outside to play, I would gravitate toward the front yard or the side garden, anywhere but that back space where the tree loomed. There was something wrong about it, something my 6-year-old brain couldn't articulate, but my body understood on a cellular level. The air around it felt heavier, colder, even on days when the temperature pushed 90 degrees. Birds never landed in its branches. Squirrels, usually fearless in their quest for territory, would stop at the fence line and turn back, as if they could sense an invisible barrier they refused to cross. My grandmother's cat, a usually adventurous tabby named Chester, would arch his back and hiss if anyone tried to carry him anywhere near the tree, his pupils dilating to black pools of terror. But children are curious creatures, and boredom is a powerful motivator. It was a Saturday in late August, one of those lazy summer days that seems to stretch on forever, where time moves like honey and the heat makes everything shimmer and dreamlike. My grandmother was inside doing the dishes after lunch, and I could see her through the kitchen window, her hands moving in the soapy water, her face turned slightly toward the glass so she could keep an eye on me. The back door was open to let in whatever breeze might decide to wander through, and I could hear the distant sound of a radio playing old country music, the kind my grandmother loved, full of steel guitars and voices that warbled about lost love and empty highways. I had been playing with my action figures in the front yard, creating elaborate battles between heroes and villains, but the game had grown stale, predictable. My eyes kept drifting to the back gate, to the forbidden space beyond, and with that particular defiance that defines childhood, I decided I was being silly. It was just a tree, just dead wood and empty branches. What was there to be afraid of? My grandmother had hung a tire swing from one of the lower branches years ago, before I was born, and though I'd used it a few times before, with her standing right there beside me, I'd never ventured out to swing alone. Today, I decided would be different. Today, I would prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. I pushed open the back gate, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped into the backyard. Immediately, the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, but enough to raise goosebumps on my arms, enough to make me pause and consider turning back. But I was determined now, my child's pride refusing to let me retreat. I walked across the patchy grass, brown in spots from the summer heat, my sneakers leaving temporary impressions in the dry earth. The tire swing hung motionless, despite a breeze that I could feel stirring the leaves of the neighbors' trees beyond the fence. It was like the air around my grandmother's oak existed in a vacuum, untouched by the natural forces that governed everything else. The tire was old, worn smooth by weather and use, the rubber warm from the sun despite the shade. I climbed onto it, positioning myself in the center, my legs dangling through the middle hole, my hands gripping the thick rope that disappeared up into the branches above. I started to swing, gently at first, pushing off with my feet and letting momentum carry me back and forth. The rope creaked against the branch, a sound like old bones grinding together, like arthritic joints complaining with each movement. The tire squeaked in response, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Creak, squeak, creak, squeak, a metronome marking the seconds in that suspended space beneath the dead tree. I started to relax, feeling foolish for my earlier fear. See, just a swing, just a tree. Nothing strange, nothing scary. The sun filtered through the sparse branches in weak patches, creating moving patterns of light and shadow on the ground below. I pushed harder, swinging higher, the wind starting to rush past my face, my hair flying behind me. I remember laughing, feeling that particular joy that comes from movement and momentum, from the closest thing to flying that childhood offers. For maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I was just a normal kid on a normal swing, having a normal summer afternoon. Then everything changed. It started as a feeling, subtle at first, like the moment when you realize someone has entered a room before you actually see them. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, prickling with an awareness that had nothing to do with the breeze. My stomach dropped, not from the swinging, but from something primal, some ancient warning system buried in my DNA, screaming at me that I was being watched. The laughter died in my throat. I let my feet drag on the ground, slowing the swing, my hands tightening on the rope until my knuckles went white. I didn't want to look up. Every instinct I possessed was telling me to keep my eyes forward, to look at the ground, to look at my grandmother through the window, to look anywhere but up into those skeletal branches above me. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger, became undeniable. Something was above me. Something was watching me. I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my small body, like invisible hands reaching toward me through the thick, suddenly heavy air. I turned my head slowly toward the kitchen window, desperate for the comfort of my grandmother's presence, for the reassurance of her familiar figure in that familiar space. She was still at the sink, but she was no longer washing dishes. She stood perfectly still, frozen in a way that reminded me of the statues in the park downtown, her hands dripping soapy water onto the floor. But it was her face that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Her eyes were fixed on something above me, wide and horrified, her mouth open in a silent scream, one hand rising slowly to cover it as if she could push back whatever words or sounds were trying to escape. The color had drained from her face, leaving her pale as the dead tree itself. And in her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before, something I didn't have words for at 6 years old. But understand, now with terrible clarity, she was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that violated the natural order, something that made her question her own sanity. The world shifted then, transformed around me in a way that felt both gradual and instantaneous. The sun, which had been bright and warm just moments before, seemed to vanish behind clouds that hadn't been there seconds earlier. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the light itself recoiling from what hung above me. A mist rolled in, impossible and wrong, creeping across the ground like something alive, like fingers of fog, reaching and grasping. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in as many seconds. My breath suddenly visible in the air, small clouds of condensation that dissipated slowly, reluctantly. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, thunderous and irregular. Could hear the blood rushing through my body in a panic symphony. I tried to move, tried to get off the swing, tried to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Every muscle had locked into place, frozen by a terror so complete it bypassed conscious thought and went straight to my nervous system, shutting everything down in a desperate attempt to protect me through stillness, through invisibility. I had become a statue myself, as frozen as my grandmother in that window, as motionless as the dead tree that surrounded me with its grasping branches. Then I heard it, a new sound joining the creaking of the rope and the pounding of my heart. It was coming from directly above me, from somewhere in the branches that loomed over my small paralyzed body, a slow rhythmic creaking, like something heavy swinging back and forth on a branch, like a pendulum marking time in this nightmare space. But I wasn't moving anymore. I hadn't pushed off in over a minute. The swing I sat on was completely still, my feet planted firmly on the ground. Yet something above me was swinging, moving back and forth with a terrible, patient rhythm. Creak, creak, creak. The sound was wet somehow, accompanied by something else, something that my brain couldn't quite process. A gurgling, choking sound, like someone trying to breathe through water, through blood. Tears started rolling down my cheeks without my permission, my body betraying my terror in the only way it could, while the rest of me remained locked in place. I wanted my grandmother. I wanted my mother. I wanted to be anywhere but here. Wanted to be small enough to disappear, to cease existing entirely rather than experience whatever revelation awaited. If I gave into the compulsion growing inside me, the terrible need to look up, to see what hung in the branches above my head, then my grandmother was there, suddenly in motion, breaking free from her own paralysis. She burst through the back door with a speed I didn't know she possessed, her house slippers slapping against the concrete patio before her feet hit grass. She was screaming my name, her voice high and panicked and desperate, and the sound of it broke through my paralysis enough to let me turn my head, to watch her running toward me with her arms outstretched. She reached me in seconds that felt like hours, grabbed me under my arms, and lifted me off the swing with such force that I felt my feet leave the ground completely. She spun me around, pressing my face into her shoulder, her hand on the back of my head, holding me there with a grip that was almost painful, shielding my eyes from whatever hung above us in those dead branches. I could feel her heart hammering against my cheek, could feel her chest heaving with panicked breaths, could smell the dish soap on her hands and the fear in her sweat. She was murmuring something, words I couldn't quite make out, prayers maybe, or just desperate, meaningless sounds meant to comfort us both. She moved quickly, carrying me toward the house with stumbling, urgent steps. And just before we crossed the threshold back into safety, I heard it again. That wet, gurgling sound, louder now, more desperate, more angry. It was the sound of someone drowning, someone suffocating, someone dying but unable to die. The moment we crossed into the house, she slammed the door shut behind us with her hip, still holding me, still shielding my face. She carried me to the living room and set me down on the couch, then immediately went to every window and closed every curtain, plunging the house into premature darkness. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the fabric. When she finally turned to look at me, her face was still ashen, her eyes red-rimmed and terrified, but she didn't say anything. She just pulled me close again and held me there on the couch while the afternoon light died and the shadows grew long. The house settled into an unnatural silence. We didn't talk about it that day. We didn't talk about it for years. Within 3 months, my grandmother had put the house on the market. Before she did, she hired someone to cut down the tree, and she made a point of watching from the window as they worked, as if she needed to see it happen with her own eyes to believe it was real. The workers apparently commented that the wood was rotten, diseased somehow, that the tree should have fallen years ago. They said it was a miracle it had stayed standing as long as it did, that it was dangerous, that she was lucky nothing terrible had happened. If they only knew. She sold the house for less than it was worth, desperate to be rid of it, and moved to a small apartment across town. She never explained to my parents why. Never told them what we'd seen. She just said she wanted something smaller, easier to maintain, and she didn't invite me over anymore. Not for months. Not until she was sure that new space was clean, untainted, safe. Years passed. I grew up. The memory of that day faded into something dreamlike, questionable, the way childhood traumas often do when our adult brains try to rationalize them away. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a 6-year-old's overactive imagination, combined with my grandmother's own fear feeding into mine. I tried to convince myself of these explanations, tried to file the experience away as a strange, but ultimately explainable moment from childhood. But I was 17 when I finally asked her about it directly. We were sitting on her new porch, drinking lemonade on a summer evening, and something about the fading light, about the way the shadows were falling, brought it all back with a clarity that stole my breath. I asked her, point blank, what she had seen that day in the backyard, what had been hanging in that tree. She was quiet for a long time, so long I thought she might not answer, might deflect or deny or change the subject, the way adults do when children ask uncomfortable questions. But then she sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded inside her, and she set down her glass with a hand that trembled just slightly. There was a woman, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on something in the distance I couldn't see, hanging from her neck by a rope. But it wasn't. It wasn't a regular hanging. Her neck was broken, twisted at an angle no living persons could achieve, and I could see the bone protruding through her skin, white against the gray-blue flesh. But she wasn't dead. God help me. She wasn't dead. Her eyes were open, fixed on you with an intensity that made my blood run cold. They were the eyes of something that had experienced death but been denied its release, trapped in that moment of dying forever. And she was moving, reaching for you with hands that were twisted and broken, struggling against the rope like she could somehow break free if she just tried hard enough. She was fixated on you, my baby, like you were water, and she was dying of thirst, like you were life, and she needed it more than anything in this world or the next. She stopped, swallowed hard, and when she continued, her voice was even quieter, more strained. When I got to you, when I grabbed you off that swing, she started choking. Blood poured from her mouth, thick and dark and wrong, and the sound of her drowning in it. While those terrible eyes stayed locked on Uesh, she shook her head. I prayed every night for months. After that, she wouldn't follow us, that she would stay with that tree, that cutting it down would somehow release her or end her, or just make her go away. The silence that followed was heavy, complete. I wanted to ask more questions. Who was she? What had happened to her? Why was she there? But the words stuck in my throat. Some things I realized are too terrible to pick apart, too dangerous to examine too closely. But I did my own research later, spent hours at the local library going through old newspaper archives, through records and police reports, and I found it. Buried in a file from 1952, decades before my grandmother bought the house. A murder case. A woman named Eleanor Marsh, 32 years old, found hanging from the oak tree in the backyard of 1847 Millbrook Lane. Her husband, Thomas Marsh, had claimed it was suicide, that she'd been depressed, that he'd found her there when he came home from work. But the autopsy revealed something else. Her neck had been broken before she was hanged, snapped with such force that the vertebrae had shattered, piercing through skin and muscle. It wasn't suicide. It was murder staged to look like something else. Thomas Marsh was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted, though he maintained his innocence until his execution in 1954. He claimed his mind had been clouded, that he couldn't remember what happened, that something in the house had made him do it. Eleanor Marsh died in that tree, died violently and wrongly, and some part of her never left. Some part of her remained trapped in that moment of trauma, suspended in death, but unable to cross over, hanging there for decades, waiting, watching, reaching for something she could never have, for a life that had been stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. The house still stands, under new ownership now, and I've heard they've planted a new tree in the backyard, something young and green and alive. But sometimes on summer evenings when the light hits just right, they say you can still see the shadow of something hanging there, swaying gently back and forth in branches that no longer exist. They say children who play in that yard wake up, screaming from nightmares of twisted necks and reaching hands. And they say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely enough, You can still hear the creaking of rope, the choking of someone drowning in their own blood, the sound of death that refuses to die. The tree is gone, but Eleanor remains. In some places, you see, remember their tragedies. Some places hold on to their dead, and some dead refuse to let go.